Good evening, and thank you for being here on a lovely Tuesday, which in Goa is sunny, and I hope is lovely wherever you are as well. This is episode 3 of ListenIn, Sunapranta's new web series. Today we're going to talk about nature, art, and our collective future with the wonderful Ravi Agarwal and Sheba Chhachhi. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. I'm going to hand over to Leandre to introduce our speakers, and then we'll begin the session.
Thank you, Ishita. Welcome, Sheba and Ravi. We are eager to hear you share your voices, experience, and knowledge over this next hour. To introduce our guest, Sheba is an artist, photographer, writer, activist who has been engaging with social and political issues, primarily in relation to feminism and ecology. Sheba often incorporates mythology and ancient iconography into her work to inquire into the urban contemporary situation. Ravi Agarwal is an artist, curator, environmentalist writer who has been exploring issues of urban space, ecology, and capital in an interrelated way. Ravi writes extensively on ecological issues and is founder director of the NGO Top 6 Link. Now, today's segment is titled Nature, Art, and Our Collective Future. It takes off from the present pandemic that has made us confront how human behavior has impacted the environment, how fragile we all are, and also made us confront the fear of our own mortality. Now, until now, we have been domesticating nature according to our own needs so that we would be able to live and survive in this world. But now we are discovering nature's ugly side. So in today's conversation, we will be trying to understand if we should begin to think of a planet where humans are no longer at its center. Can we imagine a different relationship with nature? And what could this society look like? And finally, what would be the function of art in creating these new connections with the world around us? As Ishita mentioned, Sheba and Ravi will be in conversation with the two of us for roughly 40 minutes. This discussion will be separated into 3 segments. We begin by looking at practice, then we progress onto the interrelationship between ecology and feminism, and finally on the consensus or dissensus between man and nature. This will be followed by questions we will be addressing from the audience. I invite Ishita to begin the conversation this evening.
Ravi and Sheba, you could begin by telling us a little bit about how nature and ecology came to be a central figure in both of your practice.
I think for me, it actually goes back almost 2 decades. Towards the end of the 90s, towards 2000, I was increasingly troubled by what I saw of the city around me. A process of hyper-urbanization, which was producing a kind of toxicity at every level. I was troubled by what was happening to all the elements, earth, water, air, fire, ether, that we think of as the basis of actually any kind of materiality. And I felt that they were all increasingly poisoned. A very personal experience, and I'm talking about 2000 or just around then. Every time I went into the city to go to the bank or something, I would come back with watering eyes, rashes on my hands, in an allergic condition, and I used to feel like I was being poisoned. And every time I left the city and then returned to it, this refrain would play in my head saying, poison city, poison city. And I began to think about poisoning and the city as a body. And from that came a large installation, which developed and changed over the years, called Nilkant, Poison Nectar, where I looked at the myth of Nilkant swallowing the poison that threatened to destroy the world, the entire universe. But in the installation, he is unable to actually swallow it. It's an endless process, whether it is him, a mythological god figure, or whether it is each one of us who were becoming kind of Nilkant, struggling with the poison, this endless attempt to ingest, to contain. And this whole this video, this element in the installation is placed within sort of a mandala of the city, in which on each one of a very large number, about 300 tiny light boxes, you see the senses. The senses are homologous with the elements that I just mentioned, and they are both fragmented and yet connected because they're all wired together and these wires are really visible. So as you walk through this, you're looking down at a body city, which is both fragmented but reharmonized in the form of the mandala. And I tried to raise the question of transformation. Can we change poison into nectar? The gods were seeking nectar, which turned into poison. So I think from there on, that would be the kind of beginning of a sustained engagement with questions of urban ecology.
Yeah, my relationship with nature actually precedes anything I did. I remember my first memory was of watching a white-tailed wagtail on the banks of the Yamuna when I was 13 years old as a bird watcher. And somehow that relationship continued. I used to walk the forest. I grew up walking the forest in the city. Then at some point, much later in my life, I got involved in many campaigns. For example, the campaign to save the Delhi Rich Forest, which we started in the early 90s. And so many of these became about a love for nature, which sort of has still been the driving force of why these questions I explore more. But in terms of what I was doing, my very early work, photography work, was about the street, and then I did Down and Out, the book on labor. And I think it all added to the way I looked at the idea of word ecology and nature in a very social and political manner, because what I saw in this with migrant labor and people who are living in villages coming to the cities to work was the condition why they were doing that. And one of the reasons they do that because they have no access to land, they're agricultural labor, they have no other resources. This idea of resource and social hierarchy became very embedded in the way I started thinking about it. And later when I started working on the river, again, doesn't start at work, but starts as a fascination for something. The work was called Alien Waters, and the word comes from Marx's early text on alienation. And it comes from my the reason I came across this text was I started to think about why is it like that? Why do we treat everything we call nature so badly, so poorly? What are the roots for that? So it got into this investigation into histories of industrialization, capital, etc. And also then how these things started getting controlled. So a lot of my research was about how nature control in the 19th century started, how science and technology aided the idea of control and colonization and became very, very embedded in the way we could do things with nature we could not do without science and technology. For example, we could build big dams or put steamer boats on the river, which we could not do earlier, and we could access it like we could never, or how European explorers went to South America to conquer and and how this trail of destruction was. So somehow I started getting answers how this trail of destruction has such deep historical roots. And my work became very embedded in thinking about nature as something which is very socially and politically constructed, and how different ideas of nature could exist if we thought about it differently. So a lot of my current practice over the last years has been both to explore the condition of nature, but also to think about how this is embedded, how these relationships are changing, how they were formed, what the histories of these relationships. And so more and more, I find that it becomes like a world view in how I can understand the world better, and how it becomes a merging of everything, of many histories. It's like the history of, when you look at the history of the world through feminist eyes, you get a new history, you get a history which was never written. Similarly, if you see the history of the world through the ideas of ecology and environment, you get another aspect of history which has never been written, only slowly being written, rewritten. So the rivers' history has been rewritten. And this combination of research and my deep interest in what causes these conditions, and became a very political idea for me. And also 30 years back, I started as a not-for-profit, which works on environmental issues. And it all sort of became a life in itself. And now I can't stop to think about it. And it becomes like an obsession and a preoccupation, really.
In both your practices, you've both been consistently highlighting this imbalance between man and nature. But in both practices as well, you keep away from a nostalgic representation of nature. Is this deliberate? Is it a way to bring attention to questions of dependence and ownership?
I think, as Ravi says, one began to really try and understand the way nature has been conceptualized, the way nature has been understood. And my research took me a lot into pre-modern knowledge systems, into pre-modern epistemologies, to try and understand a different kind of relationship that had been constituted, as opposed to the kind of binary set up post-industrial revolution and through the early period of colonization, all that Ravi described, as a binary between nature and human beings. Even today, even the title of our seminar is Art and Nature. We speak of humans and nature as though nature was something separate. In fact, whether it is the most cutting edge environmental scientific thinking, whether it is ancient philosophy, or whether it's simply physics, one has to understand that what we refer to when we use the term nature, which is a very vexed term, it's a complicated term and it needs to be unpacked, is perhaps this intelligent, incredible, extraordinary web of connections and relationships between all life forms, from the smallest blade of grass to the smallest insect to the largest mountain, including human beings. And we are part of this interconnected web. It's a web of being. And therefore, we cannot speak of nature as something out there and humans as something elsewhere. This binary has served very well. It has served the process and the practice and the continuing practice of extraction from nature very well as an ideological frame for seeing nature as a resource to be owned, to be controlled, and to be extracted from. So when one looks at this, when it comes to this broader understanding, this kind of imbues all my work. It's where I begin from. It's a kind of basic way of seeing, and it's not simply about the issue of ecology or the issue of environment or a feminist perspective, but it is a way of seeing the entire universe. I think it's very important to, so when I think this misperception, this actually wrong conception of nature and humans being separate is something that we need to correct. We need to continuously argue against, because I believe it is the root of what has caused the kind of destruction and crisis we're seeing today. I find in pre-modern epistemologies a certain articulation of relationships of mutuality. And in certain philosophies, particularly say in Buddhist philosophy, you find this kind of very fine articulation of this interconnectedness, interdependence that I'm speaking about. And these are things that we need to bring into contemporary discourse, into contemporary form, into the work we do. And I try and do that with whatever I'm addressing. A lot of my work has been focused around water, but in relating to the crisis over the river Yamuna, which both Ravi and me share as a continuing preoccupation, I draw upon these kinds of sources, which also involves a lot of research and kind of continuously developing deeper ramifications of this broader view.
Yeah, to sort of add to what Sheba said, I think the way you asked the question about man and nature, this already is the question of the embodies the problem, as you know, she talks about the duality and this man and nature. But the other words like mutuality, dependence, ownership, these are all relational words. So when we talk of mutuality, dependence, interdependence, or ownership, it really shows what is this, how do you break this man and nature divide? What is the relationship between these two? And it brings the question that, you know, what is the separation? What is nature, incidentally? And that's a question which I choose to answer like that nature is an abstraction. It's an abstract word. It's not a real thing, because we don't know what nature out there is. We only know the things around us. We only know the garden outside my house, the birds outside my house, what I've seen. So there is a certain kind of relationship we have to certain kinds of items of which are outside of, which we then call as nature. In a sense, nature is produced by this interaction. So, you know, for example, if you, like, I keep giving example of when I was working with other communities, for example, the fishing community, talked about the sea is not the way I talk about the sea. There's no abstraction. It's a very real, everyday experiential and lived experience for them. So how we think of the word nature, how we evoke it, how we bring it, is very much how we are embedded or how we converse or how we relate to that idea. And when that idea becomes about power and control, because mutual and interdependence are quite flat words, it shows reciprocity. When we talk of mutual or interdependence, it shows a reciprocal relationship. Many indigenous societies talk of reciprocal relationships. For example, they talk of relationships of care, or they talk of that when they take, for example, a root from the forest, they will not take the whole root. They'll take part of the root and put the part back, because next year they know they need it again. So there's a reciprocity, there's a mutuality and the respect for that. How much should you take? And when we think of nature as something smaller than us, we're position of something bigger, we are bigger. Nature is something we can control and we have power over. Then the relationship becomes one of abstraction. And I think the more we abstract the idea of nature as something out there, the more homogeneous it becomes. And when you have something homogeneous, you can apply a global sort of technology to it. So, you know, we have forgotten to evoke the specific stories of lived landscapes, but we think of the globe as a continuous planet, which it is not. It is a very particular story. The fisherman has a very particular story. The nomadic herdsman in the lower Himalayas has a very particular story of the landscape. And when we stop listening to the stories and put them into one box, we miss the nuances through which nature is produced and what that codependency is. So codependencies are very particular. It's like a particular even a human relationship. It's very particular. It cannot be generalized. So I think it only serves global capital and global power and global technology. Like, you know, if you look at the history of dams, for example, then we got our dams model from the Tennessee Valley projects in the US. You know, and the Tennessee Valley projects became the template for our Bhakra Nangal other dams. Each river is different, only serves us to know nature differently. But the moment you say each river is same, that means you can have the same design as the Hoover Dam on some other dam, really. So it serves global capital. It serves a certain kind of view of So I'm much in favor of getting the specificity of the relationship back into play and the stories we have to tell as a way of knowing something in its very diverse forms.
I think the very term Anthropocene, which simply describes the fact that human actions on the earth have now an effect that is equivalent to a geological era. I mean, that's essentially what the Anthropocene is as a technical term. And critiques of the Anthropocene have gone on to qualify it to talk about the Capitalocene, which is referring to the issues that Ravi is raising, the Plantationocene, which is the first beginning of what we today call agribusiness, and how it produces both nature exploitation and ecological imbalances, also shifts in global relationships, in movements between continents of species, etc. So this is kind of made far more complex, and I think it's important to not just use Anthropocene as a kind of catch concept with all these expansions and deeper understandings that have come. The wonderful feminist ecologist, thinker, Donna Haraway, introduces another term, which is the Thulocene, which is basically a description of the earth as a series of relationships, of embodied entanglements, to borrow some of her phraseology. And I think all of this together is something we need to consider and really move away from this kind of artificial binary between nature and human.
Right. The way the human race is today, I don't think any other species has had as much of an impact on the planet as we have had and will probably continue to have actively or even as a legacy. So given that and our capitalistic sense of existence, how do you respond to an idea of moving towards a world which would favor animals, viruses, nature over humans? Considering, I know, Sheba, you and I, when we talked, you said, well, viruses have been around forever, longer than us. So how would you respond to that idea of a different kind of world where man wasn't at the center?
What you're describing is what is now known as post-human, where the human is shifted from the center, where humans have nicely placed themselves. Again, looking at this web of connections between all life forms and all phenomena, I think that shift of understanding can possibly produce new kinds of relationships and new kinds of balances and new kinds of reciprocities. It is impossible to predict what kind of world would emerge, because we are actually at the moment in this kind of suicidal, almost desperate kind of rush towards the last bit of extraction. If we look at what's happening to the few wildlife reserves that were left, whether in Brazil, the Amazon, whether in America or in India, what is happening is that governments are actually legalizing the further last-ditch extraction of all possible resources which fit into a fuel carbon-based economy, etc., fossil fuel-based economy. So in fact, what you're seeing is, while there's this wonderful new thinking which draws upon a wide range of sources to develop a much more evolved understanding, simultaneously you have the structures of power and people in power pushing in the opposite direction. I sometimes wonder whether the powerful that are making these decisions, I wonder if they don't think about the future generations of their own family, their own children, because it is clear that if we continue on this path, we are facing devastation, possibly the end of the human species. I'm sure the earth will breathe a sigh of relief. But, and then it's so clear the solution has already been offered by your plot on Mars.
So I have, I think I have a proposal that we need to have two streams of action. One is very much about resisting what the forces of power and control and capital do. For example, this big resistance against the oil gas line, oil pipeline in North America, and or the resistance against the dams in in Northeast India and the earlier resistance movements. I think this is very powerful way of saying that of expressing another reality, which has to be done, because otherwise it becomes really abstract. That somehow we will just through thought without any action. So I think there are real issues here, because there are real forces out there which do not want this. We stand to gain by continuing this kind of destruction, and to resist it really is putting yourself out there. And I really am a firm believer that you need to really resist that, in a sense. And I remember, in a small way, when they were trying to cut trees in Delhi, we physically stopped them. We said, you can't cut them, and they had to stop. So there is something about the human will and human force to stop it. That's one thing, but it won't be enough, because we are in such a structural world. It's structured for this destruction. At least for the last 250 years, it's structured for that. Ever since it was always there, but especially during colonization and later post-colonial world, it's really been deeply embedded into the way our institutions also think about what we can do with nature. So what happened during colonization is something we are carrying on through our current institutions. Our water institutions think exactly the same way of water as the colonial institutions did. So we have taken that whole mode forward. And so the colonization gaze has not gone away, because that still holds power over nature. The second thing I suggest is that we need to reconfigure our language. And this is where what Sheba said about, I think, embodied, second word, I don't know what she used.
Entanglement.
Entanglement, and I use the word embodied becomings, which is from post-human kind of word. That the question you asked about what happens to human, what happens to animal viruses, the question is not what happens to them. Question is that world is already here, but do we have the language and the eyes to see them? For example, look at the COVID-19 virus. This is a series of viruses which they say come from zoonotic virus, come from the bat, but it has co-evolved with the bat for millions of years, maybe hundreds of millions of years, who knows? But it rests easy. For us, it becomes a contaminant. We don't have the system to coexist, but our bodies coexist with many other life forms. Almost 30 to 40% of our life forms are bacteria and other organisms through which our body functions, including things like the gut and digestion functions. But we never acknowledge it like this. The separations we have done are actually not real separation. And if you look at the new biological researchers, they're saying, philosophers also, and actually the scientists, not only philosophers, saying that this whole hierarchy of the man at the apex animal is not true. The tree of life is actually quite flat, and there's gene transfer which takes place across many species. So this is not a one-way gene transfer that somehow we've come to this perfectly adapted species. We are constantly doing gene transfers between and evolving, and we don't acknowledge it. So when we don't acknowledge it, we don't care about everything else outside us. So what will happen if the forest gets killed? We still have a house to live in, but we do not know how those forest ecosystems are critical to the way our body reacts. There was a study done in Chernobyl when people post-Chernobyl had no signs of radiation sickness, but were very sick, but they had no signs of radiation sickness. And this doctor, I think it's a published study, said that actually what has happened is that the bacteria in the gut of these people has mutated. So they can they can't digest the way they used to digest. So it's very weak and they don't get the nutrition they do. So in a sense that though they had not radiation sickness, but the organisms which were helping, allowing them to live had changed. And they could not live as human beings anymore. So this needs both deeper science, but also a new category of language. And feminism has done a lot about rethinking language, language of gender, language of patriarchy. Similarly, we have to rethink the language and if we rethink who we are, not because it's a fuzzy idea, because it's a real thing. It's a real thing. It's not just a culturally out there. It is how we have come to be evolved. And, lastly, I'd say that it's a 5 billion year old planet. Pranay Lal in his book Indica writes that if the earth is 45 years old, the human being has been there for the last 15 minutes. And so the dinosaurs got extinct 65 million years ago, which made the mammalian mammals to come up. So we have to be little more forgiving to the planet and less certain about our futures, that we will not. I really believe that we have such a coexistence and our arrogance will be our destruction.
It's also interesting that in Chernobyl, in the, I think it's called, anyway, I forget the exact name, but in the zone where nobody is allowed, there was this absolute efflorescence of all the various forms of life there. The wolves came back, the bears came back, the butterflies were as big as dinner plates. There was this extraordinary, radiation is part of the natural universe and we all absorb and need a certain regulated amount of radiation for life. And this kind of excess produced certain mutations in certain forms, which are still to be understood. But because that zone was just left for a very long time and continues, parts of it have now opened up, but parts of it continue to be absolutely sealed off, there is a kind of resurgence of forms of life that had disappeared from the area for a long time. This we have seen even in this tiny, absolutely minuscule experience of the lockdown. A lot of people talked about seeing birds in their garden in Delhi or birds on their balcony. And I was amused because the birds have always been there. It's just that nobody was actually looking or listening to them. And because the traffic is always dominant and your busyness is dominant, you actually don't pay attention.
I noticed sparrows after a long time, Sheba, on my balcony.
Yeah.
Sparrows.
So I think these little signs of the Yamuna itself, just in this short period, is much better in a cleaner state than it was before the lockdown. And this is to do with the dumping of toxic material from industries and also to do with the release of water from upstream. There are many factors. There's never just one factor. So these are tiny indicators of what is possible if we genuinely had the will to do it. And the will to do it is something that, like Ravi said, comes in opposition to the other wills to destruction, which are operating on the planet right now. And we have seen what has happened to attempts to resist. Unfortunately, only a few of them are actually successful. I think India has one of the longest standing movements against dams, like the Narmada Bachao Abhiyavan. I have not known a people's movement that has not used every possible non-violent method. But ultimately, the dam was built.
Okay, but humans and non-humans have always been in this continuous process of negotiation with one another. So is the idea of a consensus a fantasy? I'm just wondering.
I find consensus kind of, I don't know, a term that I don't like to use because it implies a kind of homogenization, of flattening out of difference. where everybody agrees on one thing. I think diversity, biodiversity, and the diversity of thought and opinions is also very important for health, for basic health. So I don't think about consensus, but I do think of shared visions, shared ways of understanding, which would include dissent. Because when you speak consensus, you could say the consensus operating in the world today is to hurl towards destruction. We're all participating in it. We're all complicit in it. So I'm uncomfortable with consensus, sorry. But, I think language and the terms we use are really important to use very carefully to examine what they mean and what they stand for.
The fact you can destroy something does not mean you should. So there are two reasons not to destroy it. One, you don't know how codependent you are. And the second is that you should not, because you can, and just because you don't know, you should not. How many species have become extinct because we don't know what they were? Just, we just ran amok. The bison in the US and the vulture in India are almost extinct. So there are so many, our footfall is so big and thick that we don't even know what we are stepping on, in a sense, and we're not aware. So if we are really the wise, intelligent, powerful species, then real wisdom and real intelligence also needs to create great awareness of who we are. And then the consensus is not negotiated. Consensus is automatic, that this is a shared space and it's a shared future. And, I think I read yesterday that, I think it was at NASA, who they found another planet many times the size of this Earth, and the sun a little less bright, many, sort of light years away, in a sense. So when we start looking at planets like Earth, which are right distance from the sun, right temperature, right rotational velocity, etc., we are not able to find, so they're probably not so many. So it's really a question of much greater responsibility. And I really sort of find it really weird when people like Elon Musk, who said that who said, well, this Earth is not going to remain, so we have to create a colony on Mars, and we have to create a library of knowledge on Mars. And the question becomes, whose knowledge are you going to create, and who's going to access that knowledge? So it's a very elitist, without responsibility kind of statement, in a thing. And I think people who live in that sphere of high technology abstractions also speak of solutions which are deeply removed from the actual functioning of the planet.
It's also pure colonial mentality, because what the colonists did was colonize a particular area, extract as much as you could. When it could no longer yield anything that was of use for you, or there was resistance to your extraction, you moved somewhere else and extracted from somewhere else, which is what mining in India is doing today. So Elon Musk going off to Mars to colonize it is an extension of exactly that mentality, which has marked the whole era that we're talking about, that has produced this kind of situation.
I think when we think about that and the idea of shared responsibility, both of you have touched on this in your previous answers, on the idea of abstraction. And particularly in India, Elon Musk does a few things. They don't, I guess, directly impact us here. But here back home, there is this sense of abstraction that's attributed to nature. So it's Mother Nature or Sister Earth, and this kind of creating these abstract ideas. How do you think that determines the relationship between man and nature and absolving us of some sort of responsibility? How does that affect all of this?
It's something that is of particular interest to me, because as I was researching and drawing upon pre-modern epistemologies and knowledge systems, I genuinely started to feel that reviving the kinds of reciprocal relationships that are described through myths, stories, images that come from these kind of ways of thinking could be a way to change our perception, and particularly in relation to water, to change our perception of water from a commodity to something that we had an integral, reciprocal, mutual, codependent relationship with. And it is actually, I think it's quite curious. When you look at the way nature, I'm using the term for want of a better one, rivers, mountains, forests have been worshipped, have been given a kind of sacred status. This came out of perhaps early periods when there was both the need to appease as well as to honor. And that also produced many fairly ecological and conservatory practices, as Ravi had mentioned, about what you take from the forest and what you don't, etc. In fact, in Nepal, wherever you go to a shrine of the Bandevi, nobody could cut a tree, and those remain the last preserved forests left in an area which has been vastly deforested. However, when you look at what has happened to this divinization, if we just look at rivers and look at the river Yamuna, so Yamuna Devi, there's a 14th century hymn of praise to the Yamuna, which is still sung today by the Vallabhacharya sect. And they describe the river in all her beauty and in all her biodiversity. Particular kinds of birds are described, etc., etc. Now, this hymn is still sung every day along the banks of the Yamuna. However, the worship that is offered is to an anthropomorphic, human form of the goddess. The Yamuna Devi has been given the form of a woman, a deity that is worshipped. This hymn of praise is sung to her. Offerings are made. She is mother, lover, benefactor, and it's an intense relationship between the devotee and the Yamuna Devi. However, that Devi is no longer the river herself. You make an offering to her, then you wrap the leftovers into plastic and throw it into the river, because the river is no longer the material body of the goddess. The goddess has gotten abstracted from her actual materiality, turned into an icon who is separated from the originary space that she came from and where she was honored. So I think this is, there are a number of associated stories to do with many, many parts of nature. So it's also interesting to look at how Prakriti, rivers, are often referred to as female and as mother. So yes, this is the nurturing, life-giving aspect that is being honored and described and worshipped. But on the other hand, if we look at what we actually do with our mothers, we expect them to clean up our mess. So you throw your little potli into the river and you somehow expect that the Yamuna is a meta deity, a meta-human power that will absorb. So people, for example, continue to believe that the Ganga purifies even though she has been terribly contaminated herself. Because the power that associated in religious texts, in ritual, has gotten abstracted from the actual body of the Ganga. And the Ganga water had special qualities and special capacities which were purificatory, but they have been destroyed through contamination.
For me, abstraction can be very useful if it brings out something essential and creates another idea which one can interact with. So abstraction in art has a great significance in a sense, because it draws out other qualities. So it has its own trajectories. However, when we use abstraction to separate something or to use it for a certain particular kind of end, for example, nationalism, or to create like the idea of patriarchy, in so many gendered words, abstract women in roles in a sense rather than as people. So I think that's when abstraction becomes a problem. And I think one, to, as Shiva mentioned, to remove it from its material reality is a problem, because the more closely we look at something, the more better we know it. And it cannot, then abstraction for misuse becomes more and more difficult for other users. So if we know, as I've been saying, that if we know something in its deeper entanglements, deeper meanings, if we understand them better, for example, we can see plastics as something which we have to recycle and throw away, but we can also see plastics as part of the petrochemical industry and part of the first millions of years, hundreds of millions years old fossilization of the planet. And that you are really extracting very deep time planet as a resource. And so then when you put it out, and then the microsystems it starts affecting and how it destroys life, then I think if you think of plastics in that whole new concept, or how it can lodge as microplastics in our own bodies, I think we will start reacting to plastics differently than saying, oh, let us just recycle them, because suddenly you have a different understanding of it. So I think it's not against science or technology, it's what is the question science is asking? What are we trying to understand better? And I think a better understanding of the world helps us in being able to deal with it in a more real sense. And as I said, if we, like scientists are now talking of horizontal gene transfers, then we will certainly treat other species differently. Or if you think how in a forest, different trees or animals coexist, and then so if we take something out, how if you make a certain species extinct, you're not only destroying that species, you're destroying the whole network of relationships that species has. So when we kill the vulture, which is close to extinction now in South Asia, then we're not only killing one animal, we are killing the network of social and material relationships. So it is to take care of all the livestock, dead livestock. It is to put it in a different safe way, and it had all these relationships with the village communities, and so it is a multitude of cultural and other relationships which get destroyed. So extinction is never a simple affair. It is like taking one piece of the jigsaw puzzle, or of a pack of cards. You take one card out and you don't know what's going to collapse. So when we think of life in this particular web of life, which is not a figment of imagination, which as more and more science is showing it is completely true, including in the COVID-19 case, that if this virus appears to jump from here to here, how many such viruses are there? And why has it jumped? These are questions which we need to ask. It's not an isolated incident. It's an incident because there are a whole bunch of changes happening around which for this to happen. Why didn't it happen earlier? So I think when we start understanding this complexity, that these events are not isolated, that they're deeply interconnected. And Pranay Lal in his book Indica, again, I quote him again, writes about how the Arctic winter changes the South Asian monsoon because of the convection currents, what happens in the equator, and how much moisture is picked up by the South Asian winds of the South Asian monsoon. So the monsoons we have in India are directly related to the depth of winter in Antarctica. So these kinds of connections, which are becoming more and more evident, will lead us to more and more in understanding of how connected we are. And I think we just hope that we should not do it before we destroy everything, because then there is no going back.
Just one last question before we open it out to the audience. Do you see a new trajectory in artistic practice? Will artists start to adopt more social ecological modes of engagement? And what are some strategies through which ecological emergencies are being addressed?
I think, we have come a long way from the 60s, Richard Serra landscape or the spiral jetty kind of land art, because now we see ecology as a structural issue of society and politics. And also it changes. There has been so much change in what contemporary art practice constitutes. It's not just the traditional material. It's a post-material, multi-material, multimedia, or whatever word you want to use. But it's a post-material kind of practice where the artist doesn't necessarily come from a particular medium, but can come from a discursive space, can come from architecture, come from physics. So the concept becomes really important, what you're doing. So this interdisciplinarity and this collaborativeness is what this moment requires. That an artist is not an isolated person, but is collaborating with many other people to think about what the artist's role is in that. And the artist is a very special role, I always believe, because the artist has the possibility of speculation, and also to think outside of disciplinary boxes, and just to go with intuition. It's like this work I did for you, which in Sunapranta for the show, which was about people wearing Not Just Another Day in 2019 December, and I see. So it's just, I'm not saying that work is something great or anything. Please don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that artists have a way of saying something which you will not find in a physics peer-reviewed paper or a chemistry peer-reviewed paper or ecological science. That doesn't mean they don't have to talk to each other. So we are talking of collaboration between the artists and other people, other disciplines. We're also talking of lodging the idea of art in society, in a discursive place. And of course, the methods of contemporary art have already exceeded those of classical material, medium-based fine arts, So we're already into research-based practices, into forensic practices, all kinds of practices. I know of artists who are growing organic farms as an art project. So there are all kinds of practices which are now emerging, and we have to embrace them all because they all have a very special quality, I feel. So I'm a big rooter for the artist as the big provocator, but also a new discursive element in helping us rethink the future.
I absolutely agree with you, Ravi, and all that you've said. And I think it is the responsibility of artists to use their privilege, the privilege of being able to speak through form and through ways that are not only textual or academic or within disciplinary boxes, to bring into the public domain this broader understanding that we've been discussing for the last 1 hour. And that becomes, when we say public domain, I think we also have to rethink the kind of spaces and possibilities within which this can happen. So it's not just taking up ecology or environment as an issue, so not simply pollution, wildlife, extinction, but really the broader, more complex frame to bring that into public awareness, because it's only with building a kind of critical mass of a shift in understanding that perhaps we can move out of this destructive paradigm that we are in.
We're going to move to the audience, and our first question comes from Tasneem Mehta, who asks, how do both of you see the ability to accommodate technology and the huge change that it will bring? How will humans that are half machines and nature coexist? Humans are at least sensual, but machines are a different species.
So I've been actually thinking exactly of that question for a long time. I trained as an engineer, and this is sort of my interest. So looking at artificial intelligence and where we are like that right now. I'm in very early stages of artificial intelligence. The question which always comes to me is that, of course, in early ages of machine learning, the machines are learning what we tell them, and then they might sort of go beyond that in some distant future. But what are we programming those machines with? And that's the question of the flat idea of human. Who's the human we are programming these machines with right now? And there is cannot be a common understanding of what that human is. What are the values? What are the speech patterns? What are the reactions? So can you take in somebody, indigenous people, from a person from the Amazon Indian tribe, and saying, this is my human, I'm going to program the machine learning with? So there is also this flattening of the next stage of the colonization, is this flattening of this idea of human to the idea of machine and technology, because technology operates like this flat kind of futuristic deliverance, of in this arrow of progress. It is the future of Elon Musk's future of the planet. So in a sense, this great homogenization which we've accepted, the word human, where there is not one human. We all, and it's a very complicated question. We have to be very careful with that, because it could be the ultimate destruction of all diversity.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that technologies are not neutral, they're not value-free. Not only is it about how the humans who are operating or building the technologies, how they're programming them, but they carry within themselves certain kinds of structures of power. So technology has to be understood as a phenomena, like all other phenomena, within the broader web of relationships. And I wouldn't reject technology, neither would I simply accept technology without asking these key questions about how is that technology contextualized? Where is it located? What does it produce? Donna Harawitz speaks of the cyborg, which is this kind of meeting between the human and a technological extension. And she sees those cyborgs as potentially liberatory kind of phenomena. So whether one emphasizes the difference between machines and humans, or human-created machines and humans, or humans and new forms of humans. I think there are a wide range of possibilities here, and they need to be examined within an ethical framework. If you're a science fiction fan, so much of what we're seeing today is actually in the fiction of the 60s and the 50s and the 60s. So we need to look at the kind of science fiction that may be being written today.
Thank you for that. We asked another question that came in, but they don't have a name. So it just says from an anonymous person. But it says that in an essay for The Guardian in 2016, Amitav Ghosh wrote, "It is as though in the literary imagination, climate change were akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel. In short, the reality of climate change is largely missing from popular fiction. How important do you think is it to address the idea of climate change in literature and in art?"
I mean, Amitabh Ghosh has said it very well in The Great Derangement and his Chicago Family Lectures, when he first talks about the difficulty of bringing in these great events like climate change into fiction. And he cites this example of how in Delhi School of Economics, where he was studying, he remembers and he shows cuttings of this great tornado. Actually, I was there in the Faculty of Management Studies next door the same day. And this great tornado which came, and how he hid. So he has very evocatively written about how, and if I remember right, he says that you cannot, the reason we haven't done it because it seems like science fiction, because nobody will believe it, that this is because we don't have the language for it. And I think somehow this goes to the question of abstraction. And I have a critique for this as well. For example, I just edited a volume for the India International Center called Quarterly on climate change. And one of the questions was that, why is it that it's so difficult to communicate the idea of climate change? And I think the problem is not that the problem is that we have to communicate the idea, because the idea of climate change is produced by a set of experts sitting somewhere. Somebody's producing this idea of climate change. Oh, the world is now changing and it's going to be a catastrophe. So please tell this to the republic, to the people. But this is the way science has become. It's become a very elite kind of knowledge production. On the other hand, if, for example, while producing this knowledge, you had collaborated with the nomadic herdsmen or the fisher folk who are seeing this climate change, or when I was working with Cuba, with the Cuban fishermen who described what climate change looked to them, then they would be participatory in the knowledge making. And when you're participating in the knowledge making, you don't have to communicate to me what the problem is. So the fact is that knowledge is being created separately from society, and it has to be then communicated. And I think the same thing is there, that we have not embraced the complexity because somehow the complexity is only described in expert terms. It's not in everyday terms we are. So if you say, or if I say that today the Goa monsoon looks different, they say, you're not a scientist, what do you know about it? So there's no place within knowledge creation to accommodate what I'm saying, in a sense. And I think this is part of the problem of how science has become very, very elitist.
I saw a very interesting project, which was working with the Eskimo and drawing upon their vocabularies to describe snow and to describe climate change. And this was a project done by an artist, a filmmaker, with a live feed over, I think, a long period of time, maybe even 3 to 5 years. And that produced, in a way, a very telling, powerful kind of statement on climate change, which was both scientific, because this was a collaboration with scientists, the filmmaker, artist, and the Eskimo people, or representatives of the people, which actually found and drew upon diverse vocabularies. So when Ghosh says that this has not been addressed within the arts, I don't really agree. Perhaps in conventional narrative fiction, he has raised this question, and then he has himself written a fiction book which deals very much with climate change, between Venice and the Sundarbans, the novel he did after the Great Derangement. But I think in the arts, if one takes a broad sweep of visual arts, there has been work happening for more than a decade, which tries to engage with depth and complexity with these concerns.
You're right.
Okay, one last question from Siddhant Dalvi. Should a minimalist lifestyle be taught in school to tackle climate change?
You know what I've been thinking about with COVID and the lockdown and the impossibility of travel and the impossibility of Amazon ordering and all this that has made us privileged urban people kind of, feel that life is not normal. I was reminded of growing up where there was often a ration on even things as basic as sugar. One was frugal in one's habits, in the way one used things. Travel, particularly foreign travel, was a once in a blue moon thing, not this taking a flight for a conference at the beginning of the week and another flight at the end of the week. So this kind of reminder of a more frugal way of living, which came from the generation that preceded us because they grew up in early post-independence India, where frugality was part of the way these families and these generations and these people were. It's also part of the way that people in rural environments survive through certain kind of practices of frugality, of care, of moving in a direction opposite from the kind of excess consumption that has become the model that we've all been seduced into through capital and through advertising and through our own desires, which have been very nicely manipulated to produce this form of consumption. So I think that too, it's not about a minimalist lifestyle because it immediately seems like a kind of austerity, a sort of doing without. Now you can't have this because times are bad. No, but to actually think of the value of frugality, of the value of perhaps people talking to each other more often than looking at a screen. Other ways of, I mean, I grew up without a television, and I still don't actually have a television except in the family home and not in my own space. But people, I mean, from everyone, from a cleaner who comes into the house to friends who drop in, they can't believe that one can live without a television. But it's possible. So I think to find, to recover frugality and care in the way we work with the materials that we use, and to bring our consumption into this model, which is ethical, frugal, careful, and constantly aware of the interconnections that we have spoken so much about today.
Yeah, I just want to quickly sort of respond to that in a very personal experience, because I think experiences have really shaped my life. I grew up, as I said earlier, playing with squirrels and then walking in the forest and looking at birds and photographing birds and the vultures, etc. And how all this came back to my life in very different ways. And I still, it's very much part of my experience. I mean, my parents are from Rajasthan, so I have a very sort of different idea of the desert landscape. All these have become so formative in who I am today. And, so frugality is not a word I think about, but I think about the beauty of what I enjoy most. And I think, like Sheba's, frugality is not something to be missed. It is what else are you interested in today? Because people are not interested in anything else. So this becomes, can you do without it? Because this is the mainstay. What gives people energy? Because there's nothing else which gives them energy. So I think if we find connections elsewhere, you'll find this is, this really pales in front of what other things you can do. A walk in the forest is something which you will remember and does a lot for you inside yourself. So I think also we have stopped giving the kind of experiences to children, people don't even play on the playground anymore. So these experiences are very, very important to get, because this is how values get formed. And values become then what we do in life, really.
So it's really very much about attention, about giving your full attention to whatever particular thing that you're engaged in. And with that quality of full attention, you actually don't need so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leandre. Thank you, Ishita.